Good afternoon, distinguished guests, faculty, current and former Golden Bears, midshipmen and cadets, and friends. I'm Captain Randy Van Rossum, Professor of Naval Science and the current Commanding Officer of Berkeley's Naval ROTC Unit. Welcome to Berkeley's 40th Annual Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz Memorial Lectureship in National Security Affairs, which since 1985 has hosted a distinguished scholar, military professional, or government official for a series of lectures on national security subjects. Most of you know Fleet Admiral Nimitz was the commander of all U.S. forces in the Pacific during World War II. However, he also has a strong connection to Berkeley. In 1926, he founded Berkeley's Naval Reserve Officer Training Corps as its first commanding officer, one of the original 6 NROTC units in the nation. After the war and his subsequent stint as the Chief of Naval Operations, Fleet Admiral Nimitz retired to Berkeley, living at 728 Santa Barbara Road, not quite 2 miles northeast of here. He often invited midshipmen from Berkeley's ROTC unit for horseshoes and beverages. He also served as a regent for the University of California, and his son, Chester Nimitz Jr., would serve as executive officer for Berkeley's NROTC unit. UC Berkeley NROTC is composed of 46 young men and women who have volunteered to serve their country as officers in the United States Navy or the Marine Corps after they earn their undergraduate degrees. UC Berkeley also hosts midshipmen from our crosstown universities of Stanford, California State University Maritime Academy, and UC Davis. Berkeley also hosts Army and Air Force on ROTC under the outstanding leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Zeke Moreno and Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Fife, respectively, all under the Military Affairs program in the College of Letters and Science. Army ROTC beat Navy to Berkeley in 1916, though they had been training officers at Berkeley since 1870 and started commissioning officers into the Army Air Corps in 1920. The Air Force officially arrived at Berkeley in 1951. It is fantastic to be able to educate and mentor tomorrow's military officers here at Berkeley. Public service has always had a great need for our best and brightest, and leadership in our nation's armed forces is no exception. The United States is indeed fortunate to have young men and women volunteer to do so, and I thank all at Berkeley who support this effort, not just in supporting ROTC, but in providing that Berkeley education that is so valuable. I want to especially thank our chairman of the Military Officers Education Committee, Professor Jonathan Wertelli, and our members, professors Panos Papadopoulos, Mark Brilliant, Danielle Coffer, Richard Rhodes, Daniel Sargent, and Eric Schickler for all of their continued support. As someone who is wearing a uniform of the Armed Forces of the United States, and who is also humbled to be a member of the faculty here at Berkeley, I'm obligated to put out the standard disclaimer. The opinions you hear today are not those of the Department of Defense, the Department of the Navy, or the University of California, Berkeley. They are those of our guest, an esteemed and experienced leader and scholar. And that is their value, to add to the diversity of opinions available and encourage us to think deeply on the challenges that face us all. With that said, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Johnson Hanks, a distinguished figure whose illustrious academic journey commenced with her Bachelor's of Arts from Berkeley, followed by a Master's of Arts and PhD in anthropology from Northwestern. Dr. Johnson Hanks has made significant contributions to the fields of sociology and demography at Berkeley, through her joint appointments in these departments. She plays a pivotal leadership role as the executive dean for the College of Letters and Science after serving as the chair of the Berkeley Division of the Academic Senate. Notably, Dr. Johnson Hanks is known for her support of the UC Berkeley ROTC programs, underlying her dedication to nurturing a wide array of opportunities and support networks for students. Her work exemplifies a commitment to academic excellence and leadership, alongside fostering an inclusive and supporting educational environment. Furthermore, it is with great honor that she will introduce our keynote speaker. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dean Jennifer Johnson Hanks.
I like the introduction to the introduction. It is my enormous pleasure to get to tell you a little bit about Admiral James A. Winnefeld. He's led a career of distinction and civic contribution, punctuated by remarkable acts of bravery and insight. The calling to a life of service runs in his blood, as both his father and grandfather served in the Navy and his great-grandfather in the Prussian cavalry. Admiral Winnefeld earned his bachelor degree with high honors from the Georgia Institute of Technology in Aerospace Engineering and received his commission through the ROTC program there. He began his Navy service as a fighter pilot, flying F-14 Tomcats, and taught at the Navy Fighter Weapons School, known as Top Gun. In that capacity, he worked with the crew from Paramount Pictures on a little-known production. After Fighter Pilot Squadron Command, he attended the Nuclear Power School, where he earned the Vice Admiral William Barron's Jr. Award as the honor graduate of his class. He then commanded the USS Cleveland and USS Enterprise. As commanding officer of the USS Enterprise at the time of the September 11th attack on the United States, then Captain Winnefeld had the foresight and courage to turn his carrier around and got the aircraft within range of Afghanistan in under 24 hours. Admiral Winnefeld led the Theodore Roosevelt Carrier Strike Group while supporting operations in support of our troops in Iraq, and later commanded NATO Joint Command Lisbon, striking in support forces NATO, and the United States Sixth Fleet. He graduated with highest distinction from the U.S. Naval War College and served as the 4th Commander of the U.S. Northern Command and the 21st Commander of the North American Aerospace Defense Command. From 2011 to 2015, Admiral Winnefeld served as the 9th Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In that role, he was the 2nd highest ranking officer in the United States Armed Forces. In 2015, he retired from the Navy after 37 years of service and now serves as a distinguished professor in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech, as well as on a wide number of boards and honorary commissions. Admiral Winnefeld's awards include the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, the Meritorious Service Medal, the Air Medal, 5 Battle Efficiency Awards, and the Admiral William Crowe Award as Joint Staff Action Officer of the Year. I don't believe I've ever read a list quite that prominent. We are deeply honored, Admiral Winnefeld, to have you with us. We look forward to hearing your remarks. Please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming our most distinguished speaker, Admiral James A. Winnefeld.
Wow. I'm tired just listening to that. I'm ready to go home. Good afternoon, everybody. Secretary Napolitano, I know you're out there. It's really great to see you. We get the opportunity to work together on the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, and she's a fantastic contributor to that. Dean Johnson Hanks, thank you so much for that overly kind introduction. I have no idea where you found all that stuff, but I got to do a better job of scrubbing Google or whatever it is. Admirals, what a pleasure to be with you. Canada, a great pleasure working with the Canadian Armed Forces as the commander of NORAD, and I'll never forget that partnership. It's little known by the American people and sometimes even the Canadian people, but it is probably the strongest and tightest alliance that we have as Americans. And of course, Captain Van Rossum, the officers and staff of the various ROTC units collectively at Berkeley, faculty and staff who might have been kind enough to be here today, thank you all. Anybody I might have overlooked, and because I don't know you're here, but most importantly, midshipmen and cadets, it's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you in the name of one of my personal heroes, Chester W. Nimitz. So I have 3 tasks today that I have to get done before we get started. The first one is, as an unofficial emissary of Georgia Tech, I'm here to welcome Cal and Stanford to the ACC. You may be a little bit insecure or unsure about that, but I guarantee you we are not. We've been looking forward to this for a long time. My good friend, the president of Georgia Tech, Angel Cabrera, has been talking about this literally for 4 years before it ever really became a thing. And these people are absolutely looking forward to coming out here and watching a football game on the West Coast. So I hope you all are feeling the same sense of enthusiasm as like, what just happened? But second, for those of you who are in science curricula or engineering curricula, happy Pi Day. All right. And then third, of course, for those of you who are graduating this year and going to enter the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, Space Force, we are very, very much needy of you. We're looking forward to having you, and I hope you're excited about getting out of this wonderful, we call it getting out at Georgia Tech, not graduating. I don't know what you call it, but we're really, really delighted. And congratulations to each and every one of you for the journey you've been on and the success that you've achieved so far. You're getting into a really, really fun and interesting and important business. Now, of all the senior officers that we've ever had in the U.S. Navy, the one that I probably revere the most is Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. Many of you may know that there's a wonderful biography of him written by a gentleman named E.B. Potter. You might have a copy of that laying around the unit somewhere, since he was the first professor of naval science here. I have a copy signed by the author at home, and that's why it's so important to me, the biography and the story of this amazing human being. I strived to emulate him, never achieved it, but tried to emulate him during the course of my career. It's a difficult bar to clear, but it's always worth certainly trying. And in the process of my career, through all that stuff that was just that Dean Johnson Hanks just read, I sort of had what I view as 3 phases to my career. The first I called learning the machine, and you know, becoming a fighter pilot, learning what that was all about, and starting to learn the pieces of leadership that I would need later on. The second part I called leading inside the machine, and that's where department head, squadron command, ship command, and the like really started to fall home. And then the last part was probably the least fun, but kind of interesting, was leading the entire machine. And that is a big thing when you have a million people in an organization trying to get them all aligned in one direction. And, you know, when I think about Admiral Nimitz in his context, because he had a tremendous amount of responsibility, much more than I ever had, as leading our war effort on the maritime side in the Pacific. You know, the things that I looked up to him the most for were his humility, for one thing, his calm and very principled leadership, his poise, and his strategic foresight. And that comes through very, very clearly when you read E.B. Potter's book, that this man was somebody who was very, very special. He was in the right place at the right time, and we owe him a great deal for his leadership during the war. And of course, he was a great leader and a great strategist. And I don't have time to talk to you tonight or this afternoon about everything I believe and know about leadership and everything I believe and know about strategy. I'm going to touch on the latter a little bit towards the end. But what I really want to do is talk to our midshipmen and cadets who are so soon, before you know it, going to be leading the young men and women who have raised their right hand and put on the cloth of our nation. And it's to me important that you enter that leadership journey with some sort of an important framework in mind. So that's what I'm going to talk about most tonight. And I will tell you that leaders at every level, not just the Nimitz level, but also the ensign, second lieutenant level, are needed for several very important reasons. One is to establish the vision for their organization. Another is to assemble a great team for the organization. Another is to guide it through execution carefully. And also, importantly, is to get it through a crisis, because you often find that the leader is the one best equipped because of his or her experience to get the team through a crisis. But I will also tell you that leadership is the key discriminator, in my mind, between excellent, mediocre, and failing organizations. And we see this in all types of professions. We see it in business, we see it in sports, we see it in medicine, we see it in academia, we see it all over the place, and especially and including the military. It's terribly important. But you will find that most organizations, including most businesses, really don't spend much time developing their leaders from an early age. It's kind of surprising when somebody all of a sudden is going to be thrust into a key leadership position, like, oh my goodness, we got to get this person, ready for this. And so they send them off to, University of North Carolina for a week-long brush up or something like that. And it just doesn't work that way. It's a lifelong journey of learning. There's no single soundbite. There's no quick help, book or anything like that that will turn you suddenly from a want-to-be leader and into a practicing and maybe even a virtuoso leader. Rather, it's a lifelong journey of learning, and I can only tell you tonight or this afternoon sort of the way you might want to approach that journey. I can't teach you everything about how to be a great leader in one session, and I'm still learning myself how to be a leader, so I don't have all of the answers either. But I will tell you that there are 3 things that you need to do on this journey of learning. And the first one is a little bit of study, and that means a little bit of reading. And you can read biographies of great leaders like Admiral Nimitz. You can read books about leadership, and there are plenty of them out there if you are selective in how you do that. But you can't necessarily, in the process of, especially of being a young officer, you can't spend all your time doing that. But I would urge you every now and then to pick up a book like that, have it on your nightstand, and read through it critically and carefully. What was it about this person that made them a good leader? What were their characteristics? And is that something that I want to become? Are those things that I can learn from? So study is important. Another one is observation. I guarantee you, and I'll talk about this again in a few minutes, you will work for people in your life and career who are really good leaders. You're also going to work for some people who not necessarily are good leaders. In fact, they may be very poor leaders. And I will tell you that you can learn from both of them. What not to do and what to do. And I would urge you to sort of collect that. And I'm going to tell you how to collect that in a few minutes. But write it down, lodge it somewhere in your brain, however you choose to go about doing that. But learn from both the good leaders and the not so good leaders. And of course, the third way to learn about leading is to actually do it yourself. To run to the sound of the guns, as we say in the military. And particularly when you're a young person, and maybe even a young person in an ROTC unit, I would urge you to, whenever you're offered an opportunity, maybe in a fraternity or sorority, to take a leadership position. This is a freebie for you. Nobody's going to remember you if you screw this up, but you're going to learn a lot by doing, and it's going to serve you well later on. And then every chance you get throughout your career, you should be hungry for leadership. Any chance you get to put yourself into that crucible and make a difference as a leader is something I would urge you to try to do. Now, it helps as you go through this journey, as I mentioned a moment ago, to have some kind of a framework in your mind. And I might mention a couple of times tonight that I sort of live my life through a series of lists. And one of the lists that I have that helps me keep myself on a solid footing is my beliefs about leadership, which I developed over 37 years in the military and every 9 years ever since. Of whenever I learned something about leadership, I wanted a place to hang it, a hook to put it on. And so I came up with 5 broad categories or domains or pillars, or what I like to say, because I'm a Navy guy, anchors of leadership that will have guided me on this journey and can help guide you. Although you may want to make your own list, doesn't matter to me, but I'm going to offer to you mine. And each of those anchors, to me, has 4 threads or links or whatever that are very supporting and important concepts that are associated with each of those anchors in that framework. And that's 20 things. So we don't have a lot of time to talk about 20 things, but I'm going to briefly touch on each of them and maybe in a few cases relate how Admiral Nimitz was touched by those particular things. And it all starts with you. And the first anchor that I like to talk about is leading yourself. Before you can lead other people, you have to get a grip on yourself. You have to control your own destiny as a leader, and there are 4 really important things that you have to do there. And the most important thing that I will tell you tonight, and I hate to diminish the rest of the discussion, but the most important thing tonight is character matters more than anything else. And I will tell you that when you go out into the Navy, Marine Corps, Army, Air Force, you may be leading the lower half of a graduating high school class. In some cases, the upper half. But they are all PhDs in character recognition. A sailor will sniff you out very quickly if you do not have the kind of character that it takes to be a leader in the U.S. military. It happens very quickly. And there are three essential characteristics. There's a lot to being a person of good character, but there are three key characteristics that I believe in. One is courage, moral and physical courage. The physical courage being what caused people to be able to run off of a landing craft on the beaches at D-Day, and the moral courage being, something completely different, which can actually be very difficult sometimes. Another one is integrity. And integrity, in my mind, is the only thing on this whole world that nobody can take away from me. I have to give it away. You can take my money. You can take my freedom. You can take my house. You can even take my family, but you can't take my integrity. I can only give it away. And make sure that you are in that position that you never, ever give it away. And then the third key element of character is something that Admiral Nimitz had in spades, and that is humility. And I mean genuine humility, not false humility. You very often hear people out there saying, oh, I was just lucky. Maybe they weren't lucky. Maybe they were good. Maybe they had a great team supporting them. But genuine humility is terribly important in this world. And Admiral Nimitz had a lot of humility when, as a young flag officer, he was offered by President Roosevelt the opportunity to be what was called then SINC US, which was the commander of the entire U.S. fleet, not the CNO, but the commander of the fleet. And he turned it down and went to become what we now know of as the Chief of Naval Personnel, a much lesser job. And he did that for a number of reasons. One, he wasn't sure he was ready. Two, he knew that he would be resented if he was leapfrogged over all of these other officers who were senior to him. And he just didn't, his ego did not allow him, his lack of ego did not allow him to do that. I thought it was a great lesson in humility from Admiral Nimitz. The second element of leading yourself is what I like to call know your stuff. It's about lifelong learning. And it's about learning both deeply inside your profession and learning adjacent to your profession and learning actually way outside your profession. And I know all the professors in here are going, yeah, that's what you got to do. But it's terribly important. And I'm going to touch on this, particularly the part outside your profession, a little bit later on in our last anchor that we talk about. But I will tell you that I used to tell my junior officers in my fighter squadron, this was tough to tell the Stanford coaches yesterday because I gave them a talk, but you can go to the gym for 2 hours a day and you can be a beast. Or you can go to the gym 1 hour a day and still be kind of a beast. And if you spend that other hour a day learning something about your profession or even alongside your profession, there's something called compound interest in this world, and the compound interest of learning grows very, very quickly, faster than you might imagine. And you will rapidly surpass your peers. Not that that should be your singular goal in life, but you will find that you're rapidly surpassing your peers if you just spend that hour a day learning something about your weapon system or something about the history of your profession or something about other professions. It's terribly important to do that. The third thing under leading yourself that I like to talk about is commit or quit. You have to be committed in this profession to what you're doing. Your sailors, Marines, soldiers, airmen will pick that up very, very quickly. And commitment is something that is something you have to run to work, whether it's literally or physically or figuratively. You have to run to work every single day. It's also important that you understand the importance of blooming where you're planted. And this is something I love. Marty Dempsey, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff when I was the vice chairman, used to say, bloom where you're planted. And Nimitz was a really good example of this. He started off as a surface warfare officer, commanded like a frigate kind of thing, a destroyer. But eventually they told him, Chester, you're going to be a submariner. And he was not happy about that. But rather than whine and complain and resist, he said, okay. And he actually became the Navy expert in diesel engines back, in the early 20th century. And people came to him across the entire Navy because he was the expert in diesel engines. So he seized that, bloomed very well when where he was planted, and did extremely well. And this is a piece of advice that I've given to my own son, who's a Marine Corps captain right now, and that is, you're on this great journey, and when you graduate, you're going to go through some kind of training program, flight school, nuke school, TBS, whatever it is, and you get to your first unit, you're going to be like all brand new. I finally made it to the fleet, or whatever the equivalent is in the Army, Air Force, Marine Corps, and it's going to be special for you. And about 2 or 3 years in, you're going to still be doing very, very special, cool things, but you're going to start to learn that there are warts in the system, that no organization is perfect. And I can guarantee you, we in the military are not perfect. And the key thing for you in that situation is do not become cynical and jaundiced and start whining and complaining. Let the people alongside you do that. Meanwhile, you ought to be writing down all the lessons that when you get in a position of power, you're going to fix all this stuff. And recognize that over the fence, on the other side of whatever, in business or what have you, they have the same problem. They're brand new and shiny when they get to Goldman Sachs. And after 2 or 3 years, they're going, this place has warts, even though I enjoy what I'm doing. So just be careful about that tendency after a couple of years in an organization to become a little cynical. Watch out for that. And then the last thing under leading yourself is what I like to call manage your brain. And there are a couple of things associated with that, probably the most important of which is managing stress. And I honestly believe that because of social media and what have you, the stress level among young people is probably a little higher than it was for me when I graduated from Georgia Tech, but it was still there. I was worried about, hey, am I going to make it through flight school okay? Am I going to get to do what I want to do? Am I going to have a relationship, what have you? And you need to learn how to manage that. And in naval aviation, we teach our young pilots and NFOs that to take the things that are distracting you and figuratively put them in a little box and put it in the corner. And that sounds kind of trite and cheesy, but it actually works. Because when you're trying to land an airplane on an aircraft carrier on a pitching deck at night, you can't be thinking about your financial situation or your parents' health or your relationship with your girlfriend or boyfriend. You just can't. You have to be totally focused on what you're doing. And then when it comes time to deal with those things, go over and open up the box and deal with them. And that is something that's a skill that's acquired. And the other things, of course, that go along with managing stress are, eat proper diet, don't drink too much, get exercise, manage your relationships and those sorts of things. But it's really important. And it's really important that your people see you managing stress, because they will do it too. And if the crisis hits, remember I said leaders have to manage through crisis, and you are panicking because you're stressed out, your organization is going to panic because they're going to see this. And if they see you as somebody who's very, very calm, then they will be calm. And in the E.B. Potter book, there's a great discussion of how Nimitz carried himself in his command center in the Pacific just before the Battle of Midway, that morning when it was about to start. And there's a wonderful description about how he was walking around tall, composed, and he was actually injecting confidence into that room. And there's a quote in there about how unflappable Nimitz was. And Colin Powell, who I had the very great privilege of working for when I was younger, had a way of saying this: don't ever let him see you sweat. And it was a great way of approaching his business. So make sure that you're managing your brain. So that's leading yourself. You got to have character, you got to have knowledge, you got to commit, and then you have to manage your own brain. So the next wonderful anchor that we're going to talk about is leading people, which sounds kind of like, of course, leading people. But there's a few special things that you have to think about as you're getting into that part of your life and career. And the first one is to build, develop, and retain the best possible people that you can. And as a young person, you're sort of at the mercy of the system when that happens. But as you get older, as you become a squadron commander, ship commander, a battalion commander, what have you, you can start demanding from the system that you get really good people. And what I discovered almost by blind luck as a squadron commander is that if I pounded my fist on the table and demanded from the system that I want this person to be a department head in my squadron, and they didn't want to give this person to me because they were trying to do the quality spread thing, but they finally got tired of me banging on their door and they gave the person to me. And that was a real empowering thing for me, because I knew that I had a quality person running that department and other quality maintenance people in the squadron and the like, and I could turn my attention to other things, being creative, working with the outside world rather than having to spend all my time worrying about my squadron. So you have to do that. And there's a great saying from a friend of mine who used to be the CEO of Walmart, Lee Scott. He said, you can be bad at hiring people or you can be bad at firing people, but you can't be bad at both. So think about that. And then the next thing you have to do once you get the right people on the bus is to connect with them. That requires empathy, and it requires essentially two key. You have to not only connect with people as individuals while respecting their privacy, but also making sure they know that you care deeply personally about them. And if a sailor knows that you really care about them, and I'll get into this in just a second, they will do the most amazing things. But you also need to understand different generations, because most of leadership is 95% of it is the standard principles that I'm going to talk about today. But there's about 5% on top where different generations need to be led a little bit differently. Hello, boomer, here I am. My generation is led differently than millennials, and they're led differently from Generation Y and Generation Z. And it's important to understand the subtle differences there, and it can make a big difference, even though it's a small slice of the leadership piece. And you can study that, you can learn about it online. I don't have time to talk about it tonight, but it's terribly important. Now, the first most important thing I told you was character. The second most important thing I'm going to tell you about leadership tonight is something that Colin Powell told me when I was his aide, his humble little lieutenant commander aide, carrying his bag, riding in the front seat with my loop on my shoulder. And he one day was musing and he said, Sandy, the essence of leading people is about holding them to the highest possible standards while you take the best possible care of them. If you only do one of those things, it doesn't work. If all you do is hold people to high standards, they'll do what you ask them to do, and they'll vote with their feet eventually. If all you do is take great care of them, then they'll go crazy on you, right? And those of you who have kids, faculty members and the like, know exactly what I'm talking about. If you do both, it's almost magic. And I will tell you, again, in my humble experience, that if you hold sailors and airmen, Marines, everybody, to high standards and take care of them, they will run through a brick wall, especially if you tell them why they're doing what they're doing. Very, very, very important. And it's important as a young officer that when you walk past something that you see wrong, as uncomfortable as it can be for you, you have to fix it on the spot. Or what have you just done? You have reset the standard, okay? And you don't want to be the person resetting the standard in your unit. And your people will actually, it's not about being their best buddy. They will actually respect you more if you set the standard on the spot rather than walking past something that's wrong. Very, very important. And then the last part about leading people, of course, is trust and teamwork. That is the coin of the realm in terms of leading people and developing them so that they know how you would think in a particular situation so that you can turn them loose and have the confidence that they will do somewhat close to what you would do in a particular situation. And Nimitz was gifted at that. Early in the war, when everything was so uncertain, and he had carrier groups all over the Pacific, Halsey, Spruance, and a number of other admirals working for him. And they were all under radio silence. And it drove Nimitz crazy, not being able to get any feedback from these guys. But if they had broken silence, the Japanese would have found them. But he was willing to turn them loose. He gave them their vision. He gave them their instructions and trusted them. And they didn't let him down. They did a fine job for him. I found that in a situation. Dean just talked a little bit about post 9/11 when we sort of raced Enterprise up to the coast of Pakistan. And I found myself in an interesting situation where I had a carrier strike group commander who was very shy about the media, didn't want to talk to the media. But the media came aboard the day before we did our first strikes. Somebody had to talk to them. And we had things we were doing all day long, underway replenishments, all kinds of things. And I could not stay up 24 hours a day. You're foolish if you try to do that. But my navigator, who was a naval aviator, a very competent guy, had gone home on emergency leave and came back right before we entered the war. And I was very comfortable letting him run the bridge all night long. And we were the night shift carrier. We were doing flight ops all night long. And I trusted this guy, and he didn't let me down. And so it's a hard thing to do, but you have to sometimes let things go, and it works out pretty well for you. So that's leading people. It's building a team, developing and retaining them, connecting with that team, getting down to the deck plates when you need to, and staying away when you don't. High standards and high care and trust and teamwork. The third anchor we're going to talk about is about leading organizations, which sounds kind of bureaucratic, doesn't it? But it's actually really important. And so the first sort of anchor there is, as a leader, to firmly establish the culture of your organization. And there's an old saying, from Covey or somebody like that culture is the collective behavior of the senior leadership. And as you get further into more and more senior positions, making sure that your senior leadership gets it and behaves the way you want them to behave, and they're culture-carrying mentors, they're talking about how the organization is going to be run, then you'll be happy if you can do that. And I can promise you that culture is not just a list of things that you put on the wall. Everybody has a list of things they put on the wall, but not everybody has good culture. It's about how somebody comes to work and feels that they're being treated fairly, that they're taken seriously, that they're being taken care of, that they're being held to a high standard, and that they have a sense of mission and teamwork, and they want to be part of a winning team. That is about culture, and it's very hard to build and very easy to destroy if you're not careful. The second thing in leading an organization is about thinking strategically. And the way you become a strategic thinker is one, through lifelong learning and learning as much as you can about your profession and everything associated with it, but also thinking critically. And I'm not going to touch on that right now because I'm going to talk about it a little bit more at the end of this discussion. The third thing about leading organizations is understanding how power works. That sort of sounds like a dirty word. It's like, ooh, power? That means, you're like pushing on people and making them do things they don't want to do. Well, very often leadership is getting people to do things that they don't want to do. And this is about understanding that there are many different types of power that as a leader you can exercise. And you need to be comfortable with using the right lever of power at the right time. There's coercive power. None of us want to do that, but sometimes you have to. There's reward power. There's referent power. There's position power. There's all kinds of different types of power, and you can research this and learn about it. It's a fascinating topic. There's a great book called Power you can learn from. But understanding how it works and how you can exercise it is something that is unpleasant necessarily to talk about, but is very important to do. And then the last thing under leading organizations is making sure that you're a great communicator. Communication is a very complex subject, and I can't get into too much tonight, but there are really two things that you're going to do as a young person. You're going to write for somebody, and you're going to present to somebody, whether it's a brief in front of a ready room because you're a pilot and you're briefing a flight, or whatever it is, you're going to be presenting verbally. And it is worth your time to develop your skills in both of those disciplines. It will not surprise you to know that as a senior leader, when you find a young person who knows how to write, they're worth their weight in gold, okay? And I can tell you that, in my opinion, you can think well and not write well, but you cannot write well and not think well. And so as you learn to write, you're learning to think. And there's this big cascade of having something important to say, organizing it in a wonderful way, finding the hook to engage the audience, making sure that you're transitioning things beautifully so the audience wants more, and all the way down to grammar and spelling, all those kinds of things. There's a cascade that takes a lot of work to get good at, and the only way you can do it is by trying it. And I was just blind luck. My dad wrote an article for Proceedings. He won the essay contest one year, and I went, I want to try that too. So when I was a NROTC midshipman, I wrote an article for Proceedings called NROTC Recruiting Worm's Eye View. It wasn't a very good article, but the editor at Proceedings brought me under his wing and walked me through how to make it better. And it was a tremendous learning experience for me about how to learn to think and write. By the same token, without getting too much into learning to speak, maybe one of the most important things you can do, first of all, is to do it whenever you get the chance, but also record yourself when you do it. You will be amazed at how terrible you are the first time you watch yourself in a videotape and you go, wow, I'm saying a lot. Well, learn to take a strategic pause instead of saying and the audience is going to wonder what you're going to say next. There are a lot of little techniques there that you can learn if you can record yourself. Very simple, very practical thing to do. All right, so that's leading organizations. Set culture, think strategically, understand power, and of course, understand communications, which are all about messages, messengers, mediums, audiences, timing, and feedback, if you understand communications. All right, the next anchor, we're getting there. Anchor number 4 is lead execution, okay? So you're gonna have to go out there and get things done. And there are 4 threads here as well. The first one is decide. Now, as a young person, you're probably going to be more frustrated by people who don't decide than you are going to be about your ability to decide, because you're kind of in the machine, learning the machine, right? But as you get into leading the machine, you're going to be making decisions. And if you lead the whole machine, you're definitely going to be making decisions. And you have to understand that there are a lot of impediments to making decisions. Hey, we've never seen this before. There's no precedent. Oh, we don't have unanimity in this group. And we can't make a decision unless we have unanimity, can we? Or all kinds of other things that cause people to not make decisions. And another thing that Colin Powell told me one time, which is very wise, is that once you think you have 60% of the information you need in order to make a decision, let your intuition do the rest for you, because you probably have all you're going to get. Or in order to get more, it's going to take you too long, and your organization is going to be waiting for this decision. So, and Napoleon had a lot of things to say about the most valuable thing for a leader to be able to decide. The second thing in leading execution is demanding excellence from your organization. And this is similar to the high standards piece, but there's a systematic way that you can demand excellence from your organization. And one of the great things that I learned midway through my career, going through the Navy nuclear propulsion program, which has a reputation for eating its young from outside the program, but actually does not eat its young. It actually will take you if you make a mistake, pull you out, retrain you, and put you back in the game as long as that mistake is a sin of omission, not a sin of commission. And they have 6 operational excellence principles that they don't teach you on the first day of nuclear power school. You just kind of absorb them, and I'll list them for you. The first one is integrity. We can't have something happening in the propulsion plant because somebody made a mistake and didn't own up to it, and now we got to do all this detective work to try to figure out what happened. We expect our people to own up to, hey, you know, I made a mistake, I opened the wrong valve for a couple seconds, and we got this weird reading, but everything's okay. Okay, thank you. And if we catch you lying, a lack of integrity, you're gone that day. No second chances on the integrity side. Lots of second chances in other ways, but not on the integrity side. So that's the first one. Second one is level of knowledge. I can tell you what everything in a nuclear propulsion plant is made of. Why on earth did I need to know that? Inconel piping, you know, whatever you want to call it. 32 steam generators on USS Enterprise, and they were all different. But I had to know that because they believed that if you knew more than you think you needed to know, that it was going to give you great confidence in operating that complex machine. And if you're a submariner and you're under the ice and something goes wrong with your reactor, you can't phone home. You got to be able to fix it yourself. So the level of knowledge is terribly important to them. Procedural compliance. A lot of lessons written in blood around the military by people who have failed to follow a procedure. In the nuclear world, we call it informed procedural compliance, because you may have to deviate a little bit if you're under the ice. But in general, we want you to follow the right procedures. Another one is what we call formal communications. And it doesn't matter whether you're in a nuclear plant or whether you're in a cockpit of an airplane with another person or whether you're in a foxhole with somebody. That person alongside you may be your very best friend in the world, your drinking buddy, whatever. But when you get into that operational environment where you're doing something terribly important, an air of formality descends on this thing, and you are no longer best buddies. You are professional partners exchanging information in a very clear and concise way. And that keeps people out of a lot of trouble when they're doing very hazardous evolutions. Another one we call forceful backup. When we're ever doing anything really, really dangerous, whether it's an underway replenishment alongside, hooking an airplane up to a catapult, starting or shutting down a nuclear reactor, you name it, or on a firing range as a Marine, we want people to have a senior person, if possible, who's not engaged in the operation but is very knowledgeable, watching, just to be able to make sure that nothing is going terribly wrong, rather than having everybody out there on the scene totally engaged in it. And the other element of that forceful backup is that if you are the youngest person on the bridge and we're doing an underway replenishment and the conning officer makes a mistake and when he or she means to come left a half a degree, says come right a half a degree, if the helmsperson goes, okay, I'm going to get yelled at if I don't just obey, and I come right half a degree, and you're going to have a collision. You should allow that conning or that helmsman, the youngest person in the machine, to speak up and say, sir, are you sure you meant right a half a degree, or did you mean left a half a degree? And if you yell at that person because you actually did mean right half a degree, then you've made an enormous mistake. Everybody should feel like they can stop the machine when they need to. And then the last part of operational excellence is having a questioning attitude. If you see something going wrong, don't just write it down and go, yep, something's going wrong. Try to figure out why. Pull the string. Ask yourself what could be going wrong here, and you'd be surprised that when you pull on those strings, there's usually more than one thing going wrong. And speaking of more than one thing going wrong, I can tell you that if you reinforce those principles by debriefing close calls in context of which of these principles was violated, what have you, it only strengthens them. And I always found that when we had some problem that we were having to deal with, that it was always more than one principle that had been violated. You can get through one of them, but it's hard to get through two when somebody's violating two of them. So I spent a little extra time on that because it's really going to come home to roost with you all when you get out into your first jobs. The next part of leading execution is embracing adversity and risk, okay? Did Admiral Nimitz embrace adversity early in his career? Yes, he ran a ship aground, and it was like, it's over, I'm done. You know, he got a little forgiveness from a few people, but in a modern age, that's kind of hard to get through. I actually ejected out of an F-14 700 miles west of San Diego in the middle of the ocean at night, and I was worried that that was going to be the end of my career, but hung in there and, made it through that situation and somehow managed to do okay. But embracing adversity and risk is really, really important because it's going to happen to you. You're going to make mistakes, or your organization's going to have a problem, and you're going to have to power your way through it. And I will never forget when I was the commanding officer of a fighter squadron, and they took all of our money away from us in the last 3 months of a fiscal year, because guess what? The government ran out of money. And I was told by a vice admiral, no offense, say, show the pain, Commander Winnefeld, show the pain. And I said to myself, that's not my job to show pain. My job is to take the money the taxpayers give me and produce the best possible fighter squadron that I can. So we're going to turn a negative into a positive here, and we're going to come out at the end of this 3 months better than when we went in. And by the way, if I tell my people, show the pain, what's that doing to their morale? And we took this on as a challenge. And whenever you have that kind of adversity, if there's some way you can find to turn it, flip it on its ear and actually find something positive, and we actually were a better fighter squadron. In fact, I almost went back to the Admiral and said, you ought to take the money away from people for 3 months in every turnaround cycle, but I didn't think that was going to be too smart, so didn't do it. And then the last thing is you need to measure wisely. It's very easy in business, in sports, and certainly in the military to lunge for the first measurable metric that you can find and chase that metric, and it can take you in exactly the wrong direction you want to go. And for our Navy, I would give a great example of we got to have 355 ships. Congress has told us we have to have 355 ships. We've said we have to have 355 ships. Well, we got around 300 right now, and we're having a really hard time manning and maintaining those. What makes anybody think that we're going to be able to man or maintain 355 ships? And if I have to have that number, I might buy a whole bunch of little crappy ships to get to the 355 number rather than the fleet that the U.S. Navy really needs. So you just have to be very careful with metrics and how you measure them. And the killer metric is the quantifiable output metric, but you don't always find that that's an easy thing to obtain. So you may have to work with qualitative metrics, and you may also have to work with input metrics as well. All right, that's leading execution. Decide, demand excellence from your organization, embrace adversity and risk, and make sure you're measuring wisely. All right, the last one. I'd say, leading people was really my favorite one, but this was kind of like my close second, and that is leading change, okay? That is just such a delight. It gets my adrenaline pumping whenever I have an opportunity to lead change, and it was something that I tried to do my entire career. And once again, there are 4 threads. The first one is challenging all the assumptions. And I have a saying that I love, it's my saying, that is incredibly bright adults will work amazingly long hours perfecting fundamentally flawed concepts because they aren't willing, they just don't see it. They have not educated themselves perhaps as broadly as they should, and they haven't challenged the assumptions. And that doesn't mean be a rebel your whole career. It doesn't mean rail against the system, but sit there and learn and particularly as a young person, maybe this isn't the right way to approach this. And I'll never forget being in my very first fighter squadron. The F-14 was kind of a new airplane. We could shoot 6 targets at once theoretically, track while scan radar, really cool stuff. So they developed a tactic that, in my view, because I had studied this as a young person, violated almost every principle of war. And it was a failure. It was called vector logic. And we would launch these big exercises and we'd do vector logic, launch the grid. And it always collapsed in an ugly heap. And we'd come back and there'd be these, finger pointing debriefs, and we got to do it better next time. And you screwed up, and we'd go at it again. And guess what? Same thing would happen. And so we started to maybe develop a different tactic, a different way of approaching the problem that actually worked out a lot better. So challenge the assumptions. The next one is to try to lead the creative process. And this goes all the way back to lifelong learning, because most of the creative things that happen in the world, take Steve Jobs and bringing together the iPod and the phone and making it into an iPhone that was wonderfully artistic. Most of these great ideas are a synergy of 2 disparate things that nobody's ever thought of before. And in order to do that synergy, you have to have one of 2 things going on. You either have to have a super empowered polymath individual who is lifelong learned their whole life and is creative and challenges assumptions and is able to bring these two things together himself or herself. Or you have to have a very diverse team that's able to go into a room, slide the pizza under the door, challenge them, give them the freedom to be a little frivolous in their creativity, give them a secure and safe space, and they may come back with a pretty interesting idea. You pick it, but you have to make sure as a leader that you're putting that process into place. The third part of leading change is overcoming resistance. And trust me, with 4 or 5 tours in the Pentagon, I know all about, resistance. And so I developed a little theory of my own that I call concentric circles of understanding when I'm trying to change an organization with individuals in it. And the innermost concentric circle is what I call ignorance. It doesn't mean stupidity. These are very smart people. They just haven't been exposed to the idea. So I have to teach them the idea. And the next circle can be a not so virtuous circle, which is denial. It's like, why are we doing this? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. You're just doing this to make yourself look good. I got to do a bunch of work now if I'm going to understand this idea. I don't want to do this. And then eventually maybe they decide they have to do this because you've used one of those levers of power I talked about earlier. And they get into what I would call vicious compliance. It's like, okay, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to show you how screwed up it is. And hopefully they don't get in those two circles, but eventually they might find themselves in what I call well-intended misapplication, where they're actually kind of understanding the idea, they're doing their best they can to do it, but they don't quite have it yet. And then finally, there's that outermost circle of buried in their body of practice. They are champions, culture-carrying mentors, whatever you want to call it, and they actually get it. And the reason I bring this up is whenever I'm talking to somebody when there's a change process going on, I want to know what circle they're in, because I'm going to have a different conversation with them if they're in a different circle. If it's the ignorant circle, it's a patient teaching moment. If it's a denial circle, it might be a short and exciting conversation. And if it's the well-intended misapplication circle, it might be another nurturing moment. And if it's the champion circle, then this person's on my team and I'm going to treat them more as a peer in that environment than I perhaps otherwise would. So overcome resistance. And then the last thing is be bold. If you're trying to lead a change process, it's surprising how many really, really good ideas are out there that just land on the cutting room floor. And it's because the leader did not have the gumption, the nerve, the resolve, the willingness to take risk, to actually push it through. And I had to guard against this my whole career because I loved the creative process. And I had to force myself to actually carry these things through because that just wasn't as much fun doing all that work as it was having this great idea. So you have to be bold and actually take a little bit of risk in doing it. And that was the title of my book. I'm not trying to sell you a book. This is a copy that I have for the ROTC unit. I wish I could have brought one for everybody, but my bags would have been unmanageable. But I have that, and all of these are in the book. So let's go back and tie some of these together with a little bit of discussion about strategy that I promised, where your courage, your knowledge combined with thinking strategically, with challenging the assumptions, might put you in a situation, particularly as you get older in this profession, of having to think strategically about some really, really important things. And when you think about where Nimitz was in the mid-30s, he was a junior flag officer. He was thinking about all this. He actually told his son, who was in the Navy, as you know, he said, there's going to be a war here between us and Germany and Japan. And it's going to start with a surprise attack that is going to be a disaster for the United States. And a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. Now, talk about foresight. All of that happened. And Nimitz said at the time, I want to be the guy in position to step in and fix it when it happens. And it's exactly what happened. So just a few thoughts on strategy as you go forward, because I want you all thinking critically from day one. When I think there are a lot of things you think about when you talk about strategy, but one of them is an essential balance among 4 variables: the environment in which you find yourself, ends, ways, and means. And you have to keep that balance intact. And whenever one of those variables changes, the others have to adjust in some way, or you find yourself out of balance, and that's very risky. So if the environment deteriorates, you've either got to trim back your ends, or you've got to find more means, or you have to be more clever in your ways, or you'll find yourself out of balance. So let's ask ourselves, where are we right now in our global affairs? As I mentioned in Nimitz, when he was in the 30s, he realized, I believe, he didn't quite say this, but he was at the end of what I would call a long wave geopolitical cycle. And if there are any history professors in here, I'm on the spot. But these cycles last longer than one human lifetime, so they're hard to see when you're living inside them. One that I can point out to you, and we'll do a Eurocentric thing here. 30 Years' War, bloodiest war per capita in European history, ends when statesmen come together and create what? The Peace of Westphalia, which was intended to prevent this terrible thing from ever happening again. And 150 years later, it happened again through the Napoleonic Wars. And at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, you have statesmen come together and they put together something called the Concert of Europe, which was intended to prevent this horrible turbulence from ever happening again. Now, there were some pretty amazing wars in the early 19th century, but you didn't have the kind of catastrophe that was represented by the Napoleonic Wars. But you had World War I and World War II. And then at the end of World War I and World War II, you had statesmen came together again and put in place what we call, many people call the international order. I like, because we're sort of a computer-centric society, I like to call it the global operating system. And it's the systems of rules, laws, traditions, customs, standards that have kept us pretty safe and prosperous through the Cold War and even to today. And when you ask yourself, what is it that causes a cycle to end? It's usually because a nation begins to fight politically, internally, bitterly, infighting. It's the overextending themselves economically and creating stress that way. And some of the other things, and the rise of an opposing power, an ambitious opposing power. And a lot of that kind of feels like it's happening right now. And we're doing everything we can to postpone it. But you, when you're in the military, could very well find yourselves at the end of one of these geopolitical cycles. And when you think about what we as a military do, and here's where I tend to be a little critical of my successors, but Chatham House rules, right? I love them all. We have found ourselves in a situation where as China has risen, as they have worked very, very hard over the last 20 years while we've been consumed by counterinsurgency to improve their military capability. And with the inherent advantages they have across the Pacific of the tyranny of distance and the tyranny of initiative, we are finding ourselves in a situation where it's going to be very difficult if they choose to use force against Taiwan, which they're not about to do, but it will happen someday, I guarantee you. And I can tell you why they're not doing it now, but they will do it someday, and it's going to happen on your watch. So what we have a tendency to do is kind of what Kodak and Polaroid did when the digital camera came along. They actually helped invent the digital camera, but they couldn't bring themselves to bring it to market because they had this franchise called wet film. And they didn't realize that if they didn't disrupt themselves, somebody else was going to do it for them. And I sometimes feel that's the moment that we're in. And when you consider what's going on in Ukraine right now, where we actually pretty wisely struck a balance among the four major elements of power: diplomatic power, bringing our allies together, economic power, sanctions on Russia, that have actually bit pretty well. They haven't had a decisive effect yet, but they've caused real stress over there. Information power, which is probably what we're least good at as a country, even though we have the best marketers in the world. But we did release some pretty sensitive intelligence, which actually helped keep our allies on board. It was very, very well done. And then on the military instrument of power, we didn't intervene directly, did we? Why? Because we didn't, if you're the president sitting at the end of the White House sit room table, you are responsible for keeping us out of that's your number one responsibility, keep us out of a nuclear war. And so the president decided to use indirect military force. Now, a lot of people would say didn't use it as fast as he should have, didn't give the Ukrainians as much as he should have when he did, but he's the one sitting at the end of the table having to live with that, not us, the critics. So we did that. Now, what makes any of us think that we would intervene directly if China attacks Taiwan? Ukraine is a partner, not an ally. Taiwan is a partner, not an ally. China has nuclear weapons. So, we are building a military right now because we've been told to do it that is designed to go in there and duke it out with these guys against some pretty difficult advantages. They've gotten to the point where they can do a pretty good job of keeping us out of there. They're just not ready to go yet because they're not ready to invade Taiwan. So maybe it's time for us to do something at what I call the third horizon of innovation. The first horizon is little technical tweaks to what you do, but still within the same operational and strategic concept. And we're really good at that as industry, as a country. We can make the radar see a little further. We can make the missile fly a little further, that kind of thing. The second horizon of innovation is more disruptive things, but still within the same concept. Stealth technology, precision-guided munitions, and the like. Maybe artificial intelligence. The third horizon is rethinking the entire concept. And we may find ourselves on your watch having to rethink this concept and maybe treating the Chinese military as not the center of gravity, but a center of gravity, and actually thoughtfully considering what it is the Chinese leadership fear the most. And what do they fear the most? Their own people. We don't really relate to that. When we have regime change in the United States, we call it an election, and the losers go work in think tanks. In China, when you have a regime change, heads roll, literally. And so they wake up in the morning with a different kind of approach to this. And if we perhaps think of a strategy that capitalizes on that, that might shape the military just a little bit differently. It may mean you don't necessarily go into the hot zone where we're going to potentially lose a lot of people, but you use the military in a different way to maybe suffocate the economy of China, which would cause them to be deathly afraid of their people. And if you don't believe they're afraid of their people, look at what happened in COVID. People were locked down in their apartments, very frustrated. The Chinese government started to sense that there was some pretty good turbulence going on, turmoil, and then they turned on their TV sets during the World Cup, and they saw hundreds of thousands of people in Qatar watching the World Cup with no masks on in stadiums. And the Chinese government realized that this was potentially going to freak out their population, and they flipped overnight and reduced all of the restrictions because they were afraid of their people. They lost 1 million people shortly thereafter to COVID, but they don't care about that. What they care about is the preservation of the Chinese Communist Party. So that's kind of a glimmer that, maybe there's a different idea in there. While we are successfully deterring China with the military we have and that sort of thing, we probably ought to be thinking maybe of Plan B. And as you all grow up in this wonderful military we have, you might want to consider how that might work for you and what does that military look like? And do you have the personal courage to talk about it when you're a senior leader? Because it's a difficult thing to do. And with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. I know Captain Van Rossum has a couple of things he wants to say, but I hope this was worthwhile for you to have a sense for the framework that I used in learning about leadership and maybe a little bit of strategic thinking. And find your own framework, what works for you, and carry it forward and hang your knowledge on that framework. So with that, Captain Van Rossum. And I'll give you the book.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. All right. Again, thank you, Admiral. Really appreciate your comments. As you stated, we'll open it up for questions. We have microphones available. Please use them so we can capture your question on the live stream and recording. Please raise your hand. I'll acknowledge you, and we'll get a microphone to you. Our microphones are going to be shepherded by our Midshipman Commanding Officer, Nicholas Jard, who will graduate from spring from UC Berkeley, and our Midshipman Executive Officer, Jacob Shackleton, who will graduate from Stanford. Midshipman Shard is slated for aviation, and Midshipman Shackleton will commission in the United States Marine Corps as a second lieutenant. Let's get started. Gentlemen, we got one in the back.
Sir, thank you for a great talk. As a parent, we want to give those lessons to our children all the time, so I appreciate that. 2 quick questions. First question is, given the possible next future president, how do we ensure the next Joint Chiefs of Staff or SINCs follow the Constitution, follow lawful orders? That's question number 1. Okay. And then question number 2, as it relates to China, being a former Army officer and working as an expat managing parts of Asia, I agree with you. Xi Jinping wants to continue the Communist Party. That is primary versus Putin being a total dictator. How do we balance the strategy of deterrence? At the same time, in my opinion, we want to make sure both citizens of the United States and China are successful, because I think interdependence actually works in deterrence more effectively than backing someone into a corner with a win-loss situation. I think when both countries improve, I saw it living and working and managing parts of China, it's good for humanity and good for peace and economics. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah.
But how do we do that? And
So I'm going to give everybody a chance. I'll answer those quickly because you're only allowed one question, but I'll answer them both. On the second one, if I had more time to talk about strategy, I was going to talk to you about 3 pillars of deterrence. And there really are 3 in my mind. One is deny objectives. If they want to invade Taiwan, you keep them from invading Taiwan. Another is impose costs. And it's not, don't think of it as imposing cost on an invasion force. You're imposing cost on the leader through his population, whatever. And the third one is what I call entanglement. And when you think about those 3 pillars, we have all 3 going with China right now. With North Korea, we only have 2 of them. We have deny objectives. We can try to keep him from doing something stupid with South Korea. We can impose costs on him for sure if he does. We have no entanglement with North Korea whatsoever. But we do with China, and it's important to maintain that. The other thing is I give businesses advice in terms of, there's profit to be made in China, and there's goodness that comes out of a healthy economic relationship, although they tend to keep it sort of one-sided in their favor, if you will. But you have to be ready when the crisis comes to saw off that revenue and that profit, and you also have to be ready to preserve your supply chain if you're relying on China to have a part of your supply chain by creating alternative sources that you can scale up quickly. And unlike what we used to do with just-in-time supply chain resourcing, maybe have a little bit of inventory that you don't really love to have because it costs money to have inventory to get you through that shock. But yes, I absolutely agree with you that entanglement is important. And it's one of the strongest deterrent mechanisms we have right now with China. First question, will the Joint Chiefs of Staff, regardless of who the president is, and I am very apolitical, you will never find a former vice chairman or chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who stands in a convention and gives a speech in favor of a political candidate. We just don't do that because we've been on the front row and we've watched this sausage be made, and we don't want anything to do with it. But one thing I can assure you, without question, that the general and flag officers who are being groomed and who are being put into those positions have the highest integrity, and they will do the right thing. And one of the questions I get sometimes is like, well, what if so-and-so rolls out of bed in the morning and wants to nuke North Korea? What's to stop him from doing that? We have mechanisms that stop that. We are only allowed to execute lawful orders. And if it's an unlawful order, we won't do it. And we always are constantly reminding ourselves that you here soon, and some of you already have, perhaps in first class, swore an oath to a constitution, not to a human being. I don't care what party it is. We owe our allegiance to the Constitution and executing the laws faithfully. And so I have no doubts in my mind at all about that one thing.
Next question.
Good evening, sir. Midshipman First Class Balker, UC Davis Marine Science. Kind of shifting the conversation back to your time in command. It's often said that command is lonely. Do you agree with that statement? And in what ways were you able to stay involved with newer generations of sailors as well as the aviation community?
Sure. Great, fun question. Yes, command is lonely because you are the most senior person in the command. You are probably the most knowledgeable person in the command, and the responsibility is on your shoulders for the American people to get this right. One of the things that I kind of enjoy talking about is being the captain of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier is kind of a very pinnacly case study in that, because what you discover as the captain of a carrier is there are 3 things that you have to do well. One is you have to understand how aircraft operate around a ship, which you can only do by doing it. Another is you have to understand the nuclear propulsion plant because you've signed for those reactors and you have a great responsibility to make sure that they're operated safely and effectively. And the third one is you have to navigate a ship on the high seas safely. And it can be dangerous out there, lots of traffic that doesn't, the masters fall asleep and don't obey the rules of the road and that sort of thing. And what you quickly learn is that you're the only person on the ship, a ship with 5,000 people on it, who has all 3 mastered. You have people in that genre who are incredibly gifted at their particular specialty, one of those things. Great nuclear propulsion plant operators. You have an air boss who's a virtuoso in operating airplanes around the ship. You have navigators and a navigation team, surface people who know how to operate in the high seas, but you're the only one who has all 3. And that's a pretty amazing feeling. It just enhances the adrenaline, to be quite honest with you. But it is lonely, but you do have to stay connected. I mentioned connecting to your people. And you absolutely have to find the time to get down to the deck plates, walk around, get to know people, ask them where they're from, and you have to really mean it. You can't just be doing it to pro forma because, you have to do it. You have to really like these people and love these people and, hey, where are you from? How's your family doing? That sort of thing. And it's really energizing for a leader to do that. And people pick up on it very, very quickly. And then the flying piece, I always managed to fly. I flew a little bit while I was the captain of Enterprise. I flew a lot when I was the strike group commander. And I really wanted to do that because we were supporting our ground troopers in Iraq. And I felt instinctively that there were things my young pilots were going to be doing, flying over the beach, that were frustrating them deeply, that I wasn't going to hear about. And I wanted to experience it myself. And boy, did that come true in spades. There are a number of things that I was able to do because I saw it to change that really made a difference for us on the battlefield, and made a difference for our troopers on the battlefield. I can give you an example of that, but I don't want to take the whole time. But it was actually pretty cool to be able to fly. And I was very careful because I didn't want to take too much flight time away from our junior officers. But for them to see an admiral out there actually flying and having fun, I was like, oh, that's cool. Maybe I want that job someday. And there's nothing wrong with that sort of suction effect, bringing people up. Great question.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, sir. I was a scallywag under your watch at the Joint Staff, and I think I had the pleasure of running your son through my school when I was a CO at Mardet at Fort Sill. Sir, you hit on something earlier I wanted you to touch on for the cadets, and that's the experience of failure. And you had a vignette about putting an F-14 in the drink. But there's two sides to it. It's your own failure. How do you deal with that? And also managing the failures of those subordinates underneath you. Yeah.
A really good question. When I jumped out of the Tomcat, at the time, it was like, what just happened? And because what it was a near collision, and we were doing nighttime intercepts, and we had altitude separation, but it looked to me like somebody was bore sighting me, and I had to get out of the way. And violently get out of the way. And the F-14 didn't like that. Engine stalls, flat spin, boom. Next thing you know, you're in the water. And you have 20-foot seas. It was a pretty amazing night. But I didn't know whether they were going to find me responsible for this or whether they were going to exonerate me. So, it takes a while for the investigation to carry through. And it turned out that I was, exonerated. But in the meantime, I wanted to turn a negative into a positive. So because I had learned how to program in BASIC, I actually wrote a computer program to simulate this tactic that I talked about, the new tactic that we were developing. And it was a really cool experience for those of you who are computer science majors. You find that when you have to mathematically code something that is happening in the real life, and you run it and it doesn't work the first time, well, it might be because you had a bug in your code, but it could be because you didn't understand the tactic. And that's exactly what happened. We learned a lot about this tactic because I managed to write a basic language computer program that I handed off to the Tactics Development Committee. That, it was just because I needed something to distract me. And so finding a way to turn a negative into a positive when you have a tough situation in your own mind, rather than just sort of dwelling on it and feeling sorry for yourself. And then on the other part of your question, when somebody makes a mistake, I think it's really, really important that you get to the point where if people do these sins of omission, if they make a mistake, that you're calm about it, you mentor them. If it's an honest mistake, you're a teaching moment perhaps, unless it's such a severe mistake that you just can't live with it anymore. The person has to be put into another profession. And then, if it's a sin of commission, they're gone. And one of the most difficult leadership things that I ever had to do was to take a young pilot's wings away. And it wasn't because he was flat-hatting and breaking the rules and doing, stupid stuff like that. It's just because he wasn't very good and he was going to kill himself. He was going to kill his backseat and he was going to kill himself. And I gave him all kinds of chances. We did all kinds of boards on him, did whatever we could. And finally, I had to make the decision that I can't let you fly anymore. And it was a guy who wanted it more than anything. He was trying to make up for it on the ground. We call it failing aviator syndrome, by doing a really great job on the ground, that kind of thing. But, for the good of the institution, I had to take his wings away. And you just have to do that sometimes. So it's a very difficult thing as a leader when somebody's really trying hard and they're just not cutting it. Sir.
Thank you, sir, for the talk. Your take on leadership is extremely refreshing. I had a question about, when you find yourself growing cynical at an organization, how do you stop being cynical? How do you turn that into a positive?
Yeah, I think part of it is the recognition that every organization has its warts, and that if I go, well, I'm going to leave this job and I'm going to go do another job, you're going to find the same thing. And it's like, okay, this is part of life. You got to take the good with the bad and make the most out of it, and try to, again, turn negatives into positive, and deal with the unpleasant pieces while you enjoy and relish, the pleasant pieces. And it's just sort of a self-discipline habit. It's like, I'm just not going to be a whiner. I'm going to try to make a difference here. And, if I can't make a difference in my current position, I'm going to write this stuff down. And when I get to that position, and believe I did that several times, to make positive change. And I think it's important to keep notes for what it's worth, and to gather those notes up when you're on the cusp of a leadership position, and review, like, okay, when I took over that carrier strike group, I had a notebook full of stuff that I wanted to make sure that we did. And we didn't do it all. You can't micromanage, or you can't accomplish everything you want to accomplish, but it really made a difference in keeping me fresh on what it was that I had learned over the course of, 20 some years, to do better. So I think just trying to keep that positive attitude it's really a force multiplier in your own life, is to be able to overlook the unpleasantness. And I'll tell you, when I grew up and as a young person moving into, being a captain of a carrier, I hated paperwork in the worst way. I just hated it. It's like, I want to be a fighter pilot. I don't want to do paperwork. And I made a decision early on that I wasn't going to just, procrastinate it and dime it off and, for another day. I said, okay, if I hate it, then I'm going to get really good at it so that I can crush it quickly and get it done and over with, and then move on to the things that I want to do. So that's just that kind of contrarian attitude, maybe, that helps you get through those things. There was a question in here, sir. If you want to yell it, I'll...
Resident 1120, new school's a great time. Question about your kind of pretty unique take on reframing the China PRC problem and maybe a more containment type strategy. How do you see the kind of innovation base here in the Bay Area and across the country that's trying to respond to this? And kind of what does that look like if it shifts to kind of a more containment strategy? And then are you bullish on peacetime innovation, or do we need a catastrophe to get it?
Well, hopefully we don't need a catastrophe, but it's a really good question. Have any of you ever heard of DIUX? It's an innovation. So I actually started that with Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work, who was my, as the vice chairman, you're kind of partners with the deputy secretary. You kind of run the budget. And I wanted to have Silicon Valley involved for a couple of reasons. One, I wanted the innovation that they could potentially bring to bear. And I learned this from the intelligence community that has something called In-Q-Tel, which is actually a venture capital arm. It's a really weird public-private partnership. It's very effective, where the In-Q-Tel will try to find something that matters to the intelligence community that's scalable to the civilian population, and they fund it. And so I wanted some of that, because I wanted the innovation base of Silicon Valley to help us, because Bob and I had a belief that I'll tell you about in a second. And the other thing is I wanted to scare the defense primes. Now I'm on the board of a defense prime right now, so I don't want to be scared, but I wanted to put them on notice that if you guys don't get out of your cycle, we're going to bring in some disruptive things that can make a difference. So what Bob and I thought through when we were, like 2013, 2014 timeframe, he had a great way, he's a wonderful historian, of talking about these three offsets. The first offset was frankly tactical nuclear weapons, when we were really worried about the Soviet Union invading Western Europe. And the only way we were going to be able to stop them was with tactical nuclear weapons, a very unpleasant thought. But that was the first wave of that. And the second one was precision-guided weapons. When we went into the first Gulf War, and we were no longer in a situation where how many sorties does it take to take out a bridge, rather than how many bridges can you take out on a single sortie, that scared the living daylights out of the Russians and the Chinese. They had no idea. So they've obviously reacted to that. We believed that the third offset was going to be what we called small, smart, lethal things, where the big, fat, slow, stupid, non-stealthy platforms were going to be sitting ducks, unless you could really find a way to defend them. And that it was going to be small, smart payloads rather than platforms that were going to make the difference. And I think we were a little ahead of our time because that's what we're seeing now. When you look at what happened in Ukraine, Stinger missiles, which we quit building 10 years ago, little tiny surface-to-air missile that was taking down Russian helicopters left and right and basically dominated the airspace. Small, smart, lethal thing. Javelin anti-tank missiles just wrecked the Russian armored columns that were trying to take Kyiv. And one of the wonderful moments of my life, it's probably not a nice thing to say, it was wonderful, but when I was the commander of Joint Command Lisbon in Lisbon, one day I'm looking out my headquarters window and the Tagus River is right there, and I see a big Russian ship going up the river to dock in Lisbon. And I said, well, I'm a NATO commander here. I can't let the admiral on that Russian ship not know that there's a NATO commander in Lisbon. So I had my guys call down there and I invited myself to lunch. And they said, sure. So I went down there and I'm in lunch and there's a beautiful table there that's got some crappy carrots and like pitchers of vodka everywhere. I would have hosted a nice lunch, but this was just going to be a drinking session. So I told them, as your guest, out of respect, I will have one glass of vodka with you and then I'm going to drink water. And they went, okay. And they went to proceed to drink all of the vodka that was on the table. And that ship was the Russian ship Moskva. And I got a tour of the Moskva that day. And it was kind of like, ooh, this is not a very good ship. I can tell you really good stories about that tour, but I don't want to take all your time. And when that ship was sunk by two relatively crude Ukrainian anti-ship cruise missiles, I was like, touchdown. But it just goes to show that the world has, many things have changed, have stayed the same. Look at what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, trench warfare, offense versus defense and all those kinds of things. That has not changed that much except for the layer on top of small, smart things. Now, to your question on China, if you're not going to go on the hot zone, you still have a good Navy that can keep, merchant traffic away from China, take off the lifeline, but you might start thinking of things like really smart offensive mines. If you looked at the Navy's mine warfare inventory right now, if I ask a naval officer, tell me about mine warfare, they'll talk about counter mine warfare, but they won't talk about offensive mine warfare. And we're back in World War II as far as that goes. And you think about what a Silicon Valley could do with some of the technologies that we have, of machine learning for acoustic processing and battery technology and communications technology and all the like, and just the artificial intelligence that would go into how a mine thinks. And you don't even call it a mine, you call it a device because it's a weapon attached to a sensor and a computer rather than a sensor attached to a weapon. There's so much to be done there. And so I would say under a new concept with China, it will be a slightly different military than what we see today. Not wholly different, but they're going to have to be. And by the way, in the wake of the 2024 election, regardless of who wins this election, the least unpalatable thing to cut to get this budget back under control is going to be defense. Because they're not going to take Medicare, they're not going to take Social Security, and we are really running up against a budget crunch. And you've already seen with the most recent budget submission, a 1% growth in the DoD budget. And for you economists out there, that's really more like a 4 or 5% cut in an inflation environment. And so we're going to have some very difficult decisions to make, which may actually be the forcing function that gets us to think of a new concept. We get an Air Force. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
For a fabulous presentation. There's a new rating badge that's come out in the Navy. Admiral Franchetti announced robotics is a new rating in the Navy. Yeah. And I'd just like to know your thoughts on what's coming down the pike with regard to autonomous submarines, robotics in the Navy. This is in keeping with what you had just mentioned.
Sure.
Where is this all leading? And in your position with private industry, advising private industry, you'll have a particular edge on this, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting that at the Naval Academy, my son was a systems engineer, and they have renamed that department robotics. So that kind of tells you where they're going, right? And there are a couple of things. First of all, there's a technical question there. How are you actually going to inculcate this capability into some of our weapons? And we're really not as far along in artificial intelligence in weapon systems as you'd like to think, perhaps. But there's an ethical issue there as well. We want to be a lethal, capable military, but we want to be an ethical military as well. And so the department is being very, very deliberate in terms of how it allows this to happen. And I actually wrote an article in Proceedings called AI Surprise in the Black Ditch. The Black Ditch is the colloquial local term for the Taiwan Strait. And the AI surprise was going to be it was an exploration of what a really smart set of minds that are networked together and networked to a headquarters could be, using artificial intelligence, not only for acoustic processing, but also for making engagement decisions. So this is a lethal autonomous system, right? And so one of the things I wanted to do was to demystify the artificial intelligence aspects of it, because most people don't understand how machine learning works, and it's not that hard. But the other thing was to explore the ethics associated with what decision phases does this device need to go through? What gates does it need to meet before it can actually shoot? And I wanted to explore that in the article. It was really fun to write. It was a fiction article, and I personified the mine as a female, just because I felt, hey, why not give women in the military a credit, But there's a lot of work being done. You've heard about the Replicator Initiative. And this is Kath Hicks, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, trying to, at scale, less expensively, trying to basically make the Taiwan Strait hell for a Chinese invasion force using lethal autonomous drones and the like. So we got to be very technically advanced. We got to keep our eye on the adversary. We need to make sure that we can defend ourselves against these things, which probably implies directed energy and not lasers, but high power microwaves. And we also need to make sure we're considering the ethical sides of that. So we had an Air Force question, or Space Force, or something. Okay. There you go.
I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on lessons learned in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Really good question. For me, the lessons learned are strategic. If you think and it's really interesting, if you think all the way back, why did the Afghanistan war happen? 9/11, right? Why did 9/11 happen? There was a great deal of resentment among the Saudi Arabian population, the Arab population, that we had kicked Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. They were all happy about that, but they weren't happy about us being in Saudi Arabia, right? So how did that all happen in the first place? Well, if you trace it all the way back, and this is why it's so important to try to learn about history, there was one conversation that caused all of this catastrophe, in my personal opinion. And our ambassador in Iraq, April Glaspie at the time, that Saddam Hussein invaded Iraq, had been on station for 2 years. She had not yet had her office call with Saddam Hussein, which is really unusual it wasn't her fault. Saddam just wouldn't see her. But right before the invasion occurred, got the office call. And she said the following: "We Americans are not concerned about your Arab quarrels." And he took that to be a green light to invade Kuwait. And when we captured Saddam and interrogated him, he said, "Why didn't you tell me not to do it? I wouldn't have done it if you said, don't do this, because we're coming after you if you do." And when you think about all the cascading effects of that, a bad communication. And it wasn't all Glaspie's fault. She didn't get very clear instructions from Washington, D.C. either. So I'm not putting it all on her. But that failed communication, and failed communication can cause the opioid epidemic is largely a result of a failed communication, where a doctor who did a study of the effects of opioid pain medication and whether it got patients addicted, basically said, most of the cases they don't get addicted. And the pharmaceutical industry took that one paragraph article and ran with it to blow up the opioid epidemic. So communications are terribly, terribly important. And the other thing is not having the hubris that as a nation, if you're trying to prevent something from ever happening again, that you need to go into a country and completely change a culture that has existed for thousands of years. To think that you can actually turn an Afghanistan or an Iraq into a Jeffersonian democracy is especially when the American people are not necessarily as supportive of it as necessary. It's just not a very smart strategic thing to do. So I think we made some mistakes there. And it cost us. For 20 years, we took our eye off the ball on places like China and Russia, and we're paying the price for that now. So having the willingness to challenge the assumptions, and what would have been the smartest thing to do in Afghanistan, I'll leave it to you, but perhaps what the Israelis do, not the way they did it, trust me, not the way they did it in Gaza, but sort of mowing the lawn. We're going to come in there and we're going to take out Al-Qaeda, and don't you ever do this again, or we'll be back. And have fun. Let your culture live on, and thereby saving you $1 trillion and a number of thousands of lives and an enormous disruption in many different ways. So that's why you need to be thinking strategically and challenge the assumptions of what your leaders are necessarily doing, while doing it in the right way. Okay, I'm going to take it from a Navy guy.
Lieutenant Marcus, thanks so much for the talk. Some of the first principles you touched on were the sort of personal moral courage and also the integrity. Can you give an example or a story from your time where your integrity was challenged or you're in a difficult situation? What you learned from that for the ship you went to?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was fortunate in not having to make an awful lot of, do the right thing instead of the wrong thing. It came up from time to time. But one of the most uncomfortable experiences for me as a naval officer was when I became the XO, the second in command of USS John C. Stennis. Your PNS was there after this happened, but we had a captain who was a tyrant. And he was sure that everybody was out to get him. He was paranoid. He was angry because he had been assigned to be the CEO of the ship as it was being built, which meant he was probably never going to be an admiral, and he felt like he should be an admiral. And he was just an angry, bitter man and had a terrible relationship with his wife. And I found myself in this uncomfortable place where I was a Navy commander, having just finished nuke school and going to be the XO of a carrier. And I was selected for promotion to captain and not yet promoted and not frocked. And he gave me a direct order on the phone: you will not walk aboard this ship unless you're wearing captain's eagles. Because for some reason he thought I had to, didn't matter to me one bit. In fact, and technically that was, it was a bit of bending the rules to do that, because you sort of had to get approval from higher authority. But I wasn't going to start my XO tour on John C. Stennis by directly disobeying his order. And I felt that, perhaps, I can keep a low profile and people will give me a pass. And they did. They understood exactly what was going on. And then I found myself as the XO having to be the shield for 18 incredibly talented department heads on that ship, at the top of their game. Between them and this tyrant. And one of the best days of my naval career was when that guy had his change of command and he left. And the sad end of the story is that he was so bitter and so angry. He did have a personal, I think a mental health issue. He ended up committing suicide and killing his wife. So this was how bad this was. And so that was acutely uncomfortable. I was always trying to make sure we were doing the right thing and that I would not do something that really mattered that he might say was the wrong, that he would ask me to do that was the wrong thing to do. And it was, again, the best day of my life when Doug Rollstone came aboard the ship and was the captain. So you just have to sometimes, like I said, you work for leaders that, you don't necessarily respect, and you just try to learn from them. So I think that's it.
Yes,
Thank
sir.
you very, very much. Great questions.
Admiral Winnefeld, thank you for your time today. You've given us a lot to think about. I really appreciate all the remarks. Please accept the following as a token of our appreciation from Midshipman Chard. We would also greatly appreciate if you'd be willing to pose with the midshipman for a photo immediately after we conclude. It's a bit of a Nimitz lecture. Absolutely, sir.
Thank you very much. I look forward to reading it.
Thank you all for attending. Naval ROTC Berkeley and the Military Officers Education Committee value your support, and we hope to see you all next year. If you're invited and RSVP'd for the banquet, you can head directly over to the faculty club as it will start shortly. Otherwise, have a great evening. Thank you.
All right.